So, hi everyone. My name's Emily. I'm the co-founder of Untangle, and we help families rebuild life after loss. So, we have a safe and supportive community where you can meet other people who share a similar experience to you. And we also work with really carefully selected partners like solicitors and therapists. So, if you need additional help, we can match you to those. I'm really excited today that Lucy's joining us. Lucy works for Cancer Research UK as a campaigns officer after losing her dad, sadly, to cancer when she was 24. And she cared for him for 4 years. But most kind of relevant to this, Lucy's really passionate about creating workplaces and opening up the conversation in workplaces around bereavement, which I think is such an important topic. I've heard countless stories over and over of people having a really terrible experience with your work, which is always such a letdown when actually, that's a place you give so much of your time to, and they don't understand, your experience of bereavement. So Lucy's also the co-host of the Grief Sofa podcast, and we'll post a link to that afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy. What we would ask is for everyone to keep their microphones off. And if you have any questions, just post them in the chat. Just put a message in the chat so you can see it. And we will field those questions at the end. And then if there's anything else that comes up, we're also going to have a time for Q&A at the end as well. So don't worry if you don't post it in the chat during the session. We will cover those in the end. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you very much for introducing me. I think that you might need to give me some permissions to share my screen. If you can do that, that'd be great. So I'm Lucy. I lost my dad actually last year, so it was in June last year. He had esophageal cancer, and he was diagnosed in 2016. And he had sort of successful treatment and surgery, and then he had a few months of remission before he was re-diagnosed, unfortunately. And then he passed away last year, sort of mid-pandemic, in June, which was very complicated for lots of reasons, as many people may well relate to as well. And something that I found really difficult was to go back to work. And it was something that I realised very quickly was very difficult for lots of other people as well. And so I started talking to a few different people outside of work in the grief community, and I met a lovely girl called Alice, who I host the Grief Sofa podcast with. And then the conversation kind of went from there, and we started building a bit of a community around Instagram grief community, which is just huge and growing every day, and it's amazing, and it's such a connecting and uniting space. But work was something that was a kind of constant topic, and it was really difficult to tackle. So I started doing some stuff at work to try and make my job more of a compassionate workplace, and then kind of created today's presentation off the back of that, after being signposted towards Untangle. So it's great to be here, and we're going to talk through a few different things. I will just try and share my screen now. Thanks very much. Perfect. So hopefully you can see that. Perfect.
Yeah.
So what we're going to cover today is around kind of navigating grief and work in the UK. What are we legally entitled to? What is a compassionate leave policy? Examples and scenarios on how you can communicate with your employer, when to return to work, and how to deal with triggers when you are returning to work. So there's a picture of me and my lovely dad. That was taken in 2017. It's one of my favourite photos of him. And he was about 2 months later re-diagnosed with cancer. So I told you a little bit about myself, so I won't dwell on it. But some of you might be here today because you followed us on the Grief Sofa. We've had lots of people who have messaged us for the link. So I hope that a few people have joined, because I think it's such an important conversation to be having. So a couple of statistics coming from the Mary Curie report, which was released quite recently, and the Sue Ryder report, which was released in November 2020. So 7.9 million people in employment experienced bereavement in the 12 months between October 2019 and October 2020. So, you know, as we're all feeling quite isolated in our grief, we're also incredibly united in the fact that huge amounts of people are being bereaved every day, unfortunately. And that actually makes up 24% of the UK workforce. So it's a huge percentage of people who are struggling and navigating going back to work and having grief in the workplace. 58% of employees felt their performance was affected by grief in the months after their bereavement. It's something that I really commonly come up with. People return to work, then feel like they can't process things in the right way. They're maybe distracted. They're not having the same output that they had before they had grief in their life. And it's something that's really difficult to come to terms with and also really difficult to navigate. Sorry. 54% of employees worried about taking time off after bereavement would affect their job security. Another huge talking point, something that actually came up a lot when we did a session a couple of months ago with Untangle, was the amount of people who were actually really struggling with going back to their jobs and had possibly even been made redundant or been asked to leave their work because of their grief and not being able to return. And then just the impact on the economy through grief, the fact that, you know, grief services are massively utilised after somebody's been bereaved because workplaces aren't really equipped to deal with it. Costs the UK economy £23 billion a year through the reduced tax revenues and increased use of NHS and social care resources. So those are really kind of key things to get us started, because I think sometimes it can feel like if we're not ready to go back to work, or maybe we've returned and we want to take more time off, we feel like we're the only ones who aren't coping. And actually, this is just a really important reminder that you're definitely not. So how do we navigate grief and work? So first top tip is to find out if your employer has a compassionate leave policy and find out what you are entitled to. Trying to have those open and honest conversations with your line manager around, you know, what kind of leave you're required to take, and how you can take it and how you can apply for more if needed. Exploring if there's any kind of phased return options or flexible working. If you work in retail, for example, it's very difficult to have flexible working. Whereas if you're working in an office job, then hopefully, especially during this pandemic, it's been a bit easier for you to have that. But having a look at those different alternatives for you to be able to work remotely, or possibly coming back on a phased return over a number of months or weeks. And one of the most important things to remember is just to be patient with yourself. You know, you are a new version of yourself when you're living with grief. So it will take time to return to normal ways of working. And it might be that you never return to that normal high functioning version of yourself. And actually that energy is used in slightly different ways. So just try to be kind to yourself and try to be patient with yourself. So legally, what you're entitled to. So, sorry, my dog is banging on the door. So last year, Jack's Law was passed, and what that does is it entitles any parents or carers with children under the age of 18 or stillborn after 24 weeks of pregnancy to take 2 weeks paid bereavement leave. Now there's lots of campaigns happening at the moment which is trying to reflect this law exactly onto other types of bereavement leave, so that we can have you know, this kind of regulation in place for whether you've lost a parent, a sibling, a partner, example. For any other type of bereavement though, at the moment, there's no legal requirement for your employer to give you any time off. It does say that workplaces are encouraged to give employment to give paid time off, but there's no legal requirement at the moment. So it's something to be aware of when you are tackling these sorts of things in the workplace, is that because they don't have the legal requirement to do so, it can be difficult to navigate. So there are really amazing organisations that can offer you support and guidance with these things, and I've included some links at the end, but Sue Ryder is a really great charity, and they are currently campaigning an ongoing campaign to try and make bereavement leave and compassionate leave something that we're all legally entitled to in the UK. So what is a compassionate leave policy? So hopefully your employer will have a compassionate leave policy or a bereavement leave policy. Sometimes they're found under different headings, but hopefully it should tell you when bereavement leave could apply, how much leave your organisation provides, if your leave is paid or unpaid, and the amount that they might pay. And yeah, this might be called compassionate leave, bereavement leave, and special leave. So if your company doesn't have a compassionate leave policy, then the employer must follow the law. So if it is in the case of a child or somebody under the age of 18, then you will be entitled to those 2 weeks off under Jack's law. But otherwise, unfortunately, we don't have those laws in place at the moment. However, it would be a really good time to have that conversation with your employer if you know that they don't have a compassionate leave policy in place, especially if you've been bereaved and you've been working with them throughout, as to how useful it is to have those sorts of policies in place. And there's a few different resources again at the end of links where people can literally kind of draw up their own compassionate leave policy on a template, and it's really nice and easy and just really clear for employees then to be able to utilize at work. So can you take a compassionate leave before your loved one dies? So for me, I think this is a really important thing to include in these slides, and I know a lot of us are here because we've been bereaved and we've already experienced that bereavement. But unfortunately, it's likely that we'll all be in that position again. So this is something to really consider when you're thinking about compassionate leave, because having time with a loved one at the end of their life, especially if it is limited, is really important. And so for me, for example, I cared for my dad at home. He was kind of critically unwell in hospice at home for those 5 days before he passed away. And with my current employer's compassionate leave policy, I'm only entitled to 5 days. So it would be difficult for me to decide whether I took the time before he died and spent those days with him, or whether I would take them afterwards, or maybe I would take them at the funeral. And without having that flexibility with those policies, it's really difficult to actually know what you're entitled to. So I would say always take the time off before they die if you have that opportunity to spend that time with them before they die. And I've actually included on this next slide an example letter of how you might be able to phrase that, because it's quite difficult to request time off anyway when you're dealing with these sorts of situations. And I will share these slides afterwards if anybody wants to have a copy of them so that you've got all of the resources. We'll share them around. So when you've been bereaved, requesting time off as soon as possible is really important. Often you won't know how much time you'll need off, but it's just being able to, identify as soon as possible, this has happened, I'm going to need time off. Please let me know what the policy is. Please let me know how much time I can have off and how I can have this approved, so that you don't have to think about it again. And hopefully you have employers who will be able to support you and not having to worry about this, that kind of do it for you. But we unfortunately know that there are a lot of places, it's actually 1 in 3 places that don't have a compassionate leave policy at all. So we know that these conversations have to happen. To try to be realistic about the time you need, speaking as an experienced grief person now, having lived through a 1.5 years without my dad, I know for a fact that I thought that I needed a couple of weeks off and I'd be fine, and that I'd done loads of processing because he'd been sick for a long time. But actually, grief creeps up, it's not linear. So there might be times where I need extended time off. There might be times there's a lot of admin to sort out, there was lots of meetings with lawyers. So they're all things that are really important to consider. Letting your manager know if you'd like the news shared with other employers, another really important thing to consider. Perhaps you'd like to keep it private, perhaps you'd like people to know, but you don't want to be having those conversations yourself. So again, I've included an example here of how you might want your manager to communicate that news back to your employees. or back to your teammates. It's really important to have these conversations because it makes returning to work much easier, because hopefully by then they will know what the situation is. They'll know if you're comfortable to talk about it, or perhaps be able to kind of welcome you back and support you in a better way. So when we're looking at returning to work, then hopefully your employer has a procedure. I think this is probably, most of us are here today to hear about what happens when you return, because it's the most difficult part. So you can check if your workplace has an absence policy for taking time off or taking a phased return. If they don't have a procedure, which unfortunately lots of places don't, there's a couple of suggestions here that you can kind of speak to your manager about. So making sure that you're ready to return to work, exploring what you might need help with and how you can manage that workload. For example, if you're working shifts, can you take, morning shifts rather than evening shifts? If you know that if you have lower moods at different times of the day, can you work that around your employment? Do you know that actually, for example, for the first, I would say 8 months after my dad died, every Sunday at 4 p.m, because that was the time that he died, I would just cry. It was like my body just knew. And so that would be a really important thing for me to communicate to my employer if I were to be working on the weekend, that actually like that time doesn't work for me. I need to avoid this date until further notice. Talking through any work updates that happen whilst you're off. There's nothing worse than coming back to 500 emails and not feeling like you are up to speed and that you don't have the information that you need. So talking to them about potentially putting together some bullet points for you, something that you can digest before you come back, so that you're really up to speed and up to date with what's been happening, and also have some expectation of what your tasks might be for the coming weeks. Talk about what support is available for you at work. So a lot of places have employee assistance programs now, also known as EAP programs, whether they've got mental health first aiders, whether they're brilliant employees and they've got a grief support group internally. It's happening more and more, so it's definitely worth utilising, having those conversations and really finding out what opportunity there is for support internally, as well as discussing any external support. And then try to agree a plan that suits for you both. It's really, really important that you have these conversations. They're really, really difficult to have. But without being honest with your employer, it's really hard for them to offer you the right level of support. So if you can, try and agree something that works for you both, but also try to make sure that you're protecting yourself and not just trying to please everybody else in the situation, because you have to try and reserve that energy. When we're living with grief, our capacity is just, it just blows up. You don't have the time to be listening to certain workplace disputes or things like that, where you can get really tangled up and feel really overwhelmed really, really quickly. So being really honest with your employer will really help. Some other things that you might want to discuss, and something that I found really useful, is any health related issues that you might have. Again, after Dad died, I struggled really badly with anxiety. I'd always been very outgoing, was very happy in crowds of people, happy to be in the office and in that environment. And then suddenly I felt crippled with anxiety. These people didn't know, they don't know this version of me. They didn't know the version of me or they knew the version of me pre-pandemic and not living with grief, and now I'm this different person. I also struggled with insomnia and really bad nightmares for the first few months, and that was really difficult for me to then focus at work and during the day. Special dates and anniversaries, for me, I celebrate everything, so every birthday, every anniversary, every Father's Day, it's really important for my manager to know that around those days I'm probably not going to be as productive and I might be a little bit more tearful, and so they can actually then put time in with me to make sure that I'm okay. And then also any ongoing administration. If you're having to deal with sorting out an estate, selling a house, it's a lot of work and it can take a long time and it can be really, really draining. And, you know, sometimes it won't work to have meetings outside of working hours. And so you'll need to have those negotiations with your employer to make sure that you can attend and deal with these situations, because they're not just going to go away overnight. Changing jobs following a bereavement. So this is a really important thing to have a think about, because there's a lot of people who feel like they can't go back to the version of themselves, and which also can sometimes mean, you know, that they don't feel comfortable going back to their job because they don't feel like that's them anymore. So it can be really hard to go back and face it. So it's very, very normal to feel like you can't face going back to the same high pressured or high responsible situation. So try, number one, to try and be really, really gentle with yourself on going back, and make sure that you are having those conversations with your employer if you don't think that you'll be able to return to a similar level role, if there's anything else within the company that you can do so that you can secure that employment. But then also, you know, reflect on whether maybe it's not the right employment for you anymore, whether you can take some time off to discover something else that you're really passionate about, or something else that's going to work for you, even if it's just in the short term whilst you get yourself back on your feet after being knocked over by grief. Taking, you know, part-time hours, trying to get back into work through volunteering, especially if you've had extended periods of time off. I've spoken to a lot of people who've been off for sort of 6 to 9 months off of work, and then they really struggle to go back because even just the daily routine is really, really tough. And actually, my best advice for people who've been off work for that kind of period of time is to try and start volunteering, because you can have much more flexible hours and you can have much less responsibility, but you can start getting back into a little bit more of a routine, and you can start getting back out into meeting new people. And even if you're volunteering online, it's a brilliant opportunity for you to just take those small steps into kind of reintegrating back into, you know, life with grief. And the other thing to just mention is that when you start a new job, it's really important to just be honest with that employer. If you've got, if you carry your grief with you, like I do with mine, I'm going to have to tell all of my employers about my dad, because I know that I will always feel like I want to celebrate his birthday, or that I might feel triggered by things along the way. And so letting my new employer know that, and letting them know how they can support me, and if I can identify those things that trigger me and I can communicate them with them, I know that they'll be able to support me in a better way. So top tips for dealing with triggers at work. So triggers can be really difficult, because they're different for everyone. So if you work in a shop and your parent or partners or whoever's, you know, your loved one's funeral song comes on, like, you have no control over that, and it can be really, really difficult. I mean, I've been doing my shopping before and a funeral song comes on and I'm having to run out of Sainsbury's, so like working in that environment can be really, really tough. For me, I mean, it's quite unique. I work at Cancer Research UK. I knew that Dad had cancer when I joined the charity. That was one of the reasons why I joined the charity. I love working there. I love being close to the cause. And in some days it makes me feel really, really connected to him, and I feel really great about being there. And then some days they have a breakthrough of a drug in esophageal cancer, or I speak to an esophageal cancer patient who survived, and my heart breaks. You know, I'm triggered by that, and it can be really, really tough. So try to step away from your desk. For me, being out in nature is the biggest thing. As soon as anything triggers me, I put my things away, or I let my boss know that I need to just take a few minutes, and I get outside and I walk, you know, even if it's around the block, just being outside and just being away from things for a few minutes, just so that I can digest, and so that I can just take a minute. Some days I can't come back to my desk, but you have to be really honest and flexible with your employer for them to be able to support you in doing those sorts of things. If you can identify the triggers, letting your employer know what they are, so that they can hopefully, if they're really brilliant, if you have a really brilliant manager, can help you when you're having those triggering situations and can really support you in them. And again, I'm going to say this on every slide probably, but just be kind to yourself. This is not linear. In 10 years' time, you might still be triggered by the things that triggered you on day one. And we have to find time and space for grief. We can't shut it away in a box when we're at work. I mean, sometimes we can for days and days and days and weeks and weeks and weeks, but sometimes it might creep up. So just being able to accept the fact that you're living with grief and that you've experienced a huge loss, and to allow your mind and your body to react in the way that it needs to react when you have these triggering situations, and giving it space to accept those moments so that you can hopefully learn how to deal with them and move through with them. I don't think moving on is the right word, but you have to be able to carry them with you and deal with them when they, when they come to a head. So so when I first came back to work, I realized that our compassionate leave policy was not very good, because it was just really vague, and it meant that managers were able to use their discretion as to how much time you got off. So if you have a really brilliant manager and you've got a brilliant relationship with them, then you might get a month off when somebody dies. And if you had a really difficult manager who maybe hadn't managed anybody who'd been bereaved before and they'd never been bereaved themselves, they might only give you a few days off. And that can be really difficult. So how you can help create a compassionate workplace is to kind of have a look at what your employer's compassionate leave guidance is, or their policy is. And if they don't have any, then I would highly recommend them having a look at the ACAS template, because really, really easy template with advice and example policies that they can mirror. Mary Curie UK has also just launched a brilliant hub, which is brilliant for both employees who are returning, with loads of resources, loads of tips and guidance and templates for how you can have conversations with your managers, with your employers, but also loads of support around if you're facing a legal situation where you're being dismissed or you're being asked to leave because of the time off that you've had to take. It's a brilliant hub, and I would highly recommend having a look at it yourselves, but also sharing it with your workplace, because it's a great place that they can learn from. And then I also would suggest that you try and either have a bit of a grief community at work if you work in that kind of environment. I'm very lucky, I work in a cancer charity. When I suggested setting up a grief group at work, it was very much required, and there were lots of people who wanted to join. There's a lot of people who work at the charity because they've been bereaved through cancer, so it worked really well where I work, but that might not be what works where you are. So it might be finding those networks outside of work that you can kind of talk to people who you find similar connections with, just like this today. Following places like Untangle, Let's Talk About Loss, the Death Cafe, meeting other people, sharing those experiences will really help. And if you feel really passionate about it, then take the plunge and speak to HR at your employers, with your employer, because it's really important for us to create compassionate workplaces. I was really lucky. I have an incredibly brilliant manager, and I was very, very well supported, but it was very quick and apparent to me how difficult it was for lots of other people, not just at the charity, but across the grief community. And so that's why I'm really passionate about doing these sorts of talks, because I think it's really important for us to kind of be advocating in these areas. I think it's really important that if we haven't had the best support as well, that we try and pave the way for people who are coming after us, because we know that we're going to be working with bereaved employees and colleagues at some point. So that is it from me. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll let Emily come in for a second.
Would help if I unmute myself. Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and I think it's also great to hear a mix of kind of your experience. Also, actually hearing that even Cancer Research UK initially didn't have the best bereavement policy is probably comforting to say for all of us, actually, to understand that this is still a long way off for all organizations. And I think that's something that we really do need to address. So thank you. And it's a shame sometimes that it has to come from the people that have been bereaved, right, to make the change, but also and it's something we're looking at as well, Untangle, like what can we do to encourage organizations to have better policies. So but that was really, really interesting and really helpful, and very practical tools, which I think is useful to hear. Has anyone got any questions? Ali, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name's Ali. Nice to meet you. I've got just a basic question and I'll give the rest of the time to the floor. I get a lot of flashbacks basically, and I do get insomnia as well. Sorry to quote the Faithless track from 1996. I'm 37-year-old. It reminds me of that time, of that Faithless tune, Insomnia. My apologies. You were speaking about music. So I struggle with insomnia. I get flashbacks about the time when I had that person in my life, like different memories and stuff. But I found that walking, I know there was a slide that showed that actually walking and getting a lot of fresh air kind of helps move the memories closer away from your mind and more towards nature. So do you have any advice I know this is going to sound like a big thing, but any advice to like tackle insomnia? Thanks.
Thanks, Ali. So insomnia is really tricky because there's actually loads of science behind why people have insomnia, which I'm not qualified in giving you advice on at all. So I'd say if you've got prolonged periods of it, I would absolutely speak to your GP, because there's definitely things that they can do to help you with those sorts of things. If you're looking at, for me, I found I did most of my processing of my dad's death that was kind of PTSD, because it was very much like end of life cancer care. It was pretty grueling to see somebody like that, and it gave me those flashbacks, and that was what came at night, and that's what kept me awake, because I would have these nightmares and then I would be awake, and then I wouldn't be able to get it out of my mind because I'd be having those flashbacks. I don't walk in the middle of the night for obvious reasons, but one of the things that I did do is that when I was walking in the day, is that I would listen to books around grief, or I'd listen to podcasts that discuss grief, and I found that that really helped me process a lot of those memories in the daytime that stopped me from having those nightmares in the evening, if that makes sense. I see Barbara's also said meditation really helped her with sleep, and I think that's quite common. I really struggle to meditate. I don't think that my brain stops ticking enough for me to meditate, but I know that meditation can really help with that kind of zoning out and being able to rest your mind. The thing with grief is that when you're asleep, your brain is still processing. It's still processing everything. And when people quite commonly have those PTSD aftershocks in those kind of few months, especially after somebody dies, it can be really difficult for your brain to understand it. So it just runs and runs and runs, and those flashbacks keep coming. So, over time, I really hope that those things will get better for you and that you'll find a thing that works. But I think it is a bit of a trial and error thing. You have to just try different things until you find something that works.
You're very kind. Thank you for your help. Thank you so much.
Francesca's just put in the chat, you may have already tried this. It may sound silly. Nothing sounds silly. Sleepy tea. Sleepy tea is brilliant. I also discovered sleepy tea after my dad died, and I have it every night now. Like I swear by it. I think it's brilliant. It definitely helps me get to sleep.
And there's good old Ovaltine as well. I don't know if anyone ever has it, but I find it delicious and always helps me go to sleep. Great. Heidi said that walking definitely helps, and calming candles, lavender spray.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the things with grief, is that you don't really, because it's such a new emotion in a way, and you don't really know what to expect, and it comes that it's a constant like moving feast to try and work out what works for you in response to the new things that are coming up.
Absolutely. And I think one of the difficult things is that grief continues to evolve in very different ways throughout your life. So what triggers you in the first 6 months might not trigger you in a year's time. And it's constantly like a relentless trying to guess and trying to figure out the things that work to help you. One thing that I actually forgot to mention in the slides, which I think is really important to mention now, is a lot of people are worried about getting doctor's notes from the GP to try to have more time off work. And the reality is, because we are so far behind in the UK with bereavement support within the workplace, a lot of grief, a lot of people who've been bereaved have to take time off for much longer than their employers would like, or their employers have in their policies that they're allowed to. Don't ever be afraid to use a doctor's note. Don't ever be afraid to ask your GP for that kind of support, because it's incredibly important that you've got the time that you need to process the loss of a life. It's incredibly traumatic, even if you have years and years to prepare for it. Even if the person was 108 and they lived a great life, you have to process that loss either way, and it will creep up. You can't outrun it. And so I think just to mention that, GP, if you're struggling with your employer not allowing you time off, then do utilize speaking to your GP, because they are very supportive usually in giving doctor's notes so that you can have extended time off work.
One of those, it's actually I mean, it's really useful that people can get doctor's notes, but it's terrible that is, grief is not a medical thing. It's just so natural, so human. It's part of love in a way. And the fact that in the UK we have to go to that's the avenue that most people I speak to end up getting a doctor's note. That feels like the most kind of common route almost to getting that time and space that you need, is a real problem with our system.
Absolutely. I love the quote, Georgia, that you've just put in the chat. Grief is love with nowhere to go. I've seen it on a few different things, and I think it's perfect that it sums it up. Yeah. Wow, Jax, it is horrifying when you hear about people who've been kind of signed off because of grief, because their employer isn't willing to navigate and support it. And I'm really sorry that you've had that experience. It's really stressful. Sorry, I'm just reading this.
You want me to? I can.
It's okay.
Someone's asked, what did you find most helpful with your grief?
What did I find most helpful? What did I find most helpful? So I am incredibly lucky, and I have a brilliant partner who supports me like no end, and they would sit with me through the really, really difficult days, and there are still a lot of very difficult days. The biggest lesson that I learned, and the thing that I'm so glad that I learned when I did, was if I am having a bad day, I have to sit with it and I have to give it space. It's the most important thing to help me function every day, because I quite often, like, I would say that I probably have like 2 really bad debilitating days a month. And like at the beginning, that was 3 weeks of every month were really bad and really debilitating, and I couldn't do anything. And I just fought through it, because you're in survival mode, and realistically, like, who can give up 3 weeks of every month to sit on the sofa and cry? Like, it's really difficult. Life has to continue in some way, shape or form around you. But I learned to sit with it, and I learned to kind of identify the days that I just needed to sit in it. And I sit on those days now, and I like listen to really sad music, and I watch really sad films, and I look through lovely pictures of my dad, and I just let myself be sad. And it's something that we really try and push past. I don't know if it's like a British culture thing that we are all just very like trying to be stiff upper lip, even if we're really big empaths, and even if we've got great big hearts and feel lots of emotion, we still try to just like stick to it and go on with it. So I would say, yeah, that's the most helpful thing, was learning that I just needed to sit with it, because I wouldn't be able to have a good day in the following weeks if I didn't. I would just carry it with me. And I think it gave me more capacity. Like, I think of grief as this kind of, I think of grief as a ball, and I think of it kind of being, or like a water balloon maybe, filled up. On the really big difficult days, it's like all the way to the top. I have no capacity. It means I don't want to walk the dog. It means I don't want to cook dinner. It means I don't want to see a friend. It means I don't have any capacity for anything. And then on the days that I'm able to like sit there and then just like kind of let it all drain out, I have more capacity for things. I have, you know, I can go back to work, or I can talk to my partner, or I can walk the dog, and I can cook dinner. But you have to give it space. If you don't give it space, it just bubbles. You just burst eventually. It's really difficult. Thanks, Barbara. Anger is a really, really common emotion. Anger and jealousy are two emotions that we try not to like allow ourselves to have as well. You're totally allowed to be angry. Like, your husband died, and that's really, really, really crap. And I think it's really difficult, especially when you've got really complex relationships with family, because people grieve in very different ways. And when you feel like people haven't been there to support you, then it can be really infuriating. I personally lost quite a lot of friends through grief, because I just didn't feel like they supported me in the right way. And I'm lucky to have family that do support me, but they do grieve in a very different way to me, and that can be very difficult as well. And yeah, people don't get it. Like, unless they've experienced it, unless they have compassion, unless they have empathy, it can be really, really difficult. And I'm really sorry that you've had to navigate through all of that. And I'm really sorry that you lost your husband. It's just impossibly hard.
One of the things we sometimes talk about Untangle is like you have your loss, and then you have all these secondary losses. So, you know, your friends or your family not being supportive, or grieving in different ways, or you know, potentially an income stream. Like, there's all these other things that come with a loss that no one ever tells you, you know, and you're kind of grappling with all of it at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot of, you do lose a lot of friends. You can lose relationships really quickly, because it's really hard to maintain relationships even when we're on great form. When you're having a great time, life gets busy. Plus the pandemic, throwing a pandemic in there, and you know, if people have been bereaved in the last 2 years and you're on this call, then like, congratulations for being here, because it's been a hard time to be dealing with this. And I think the knock-on effect is really starting to show. Like, and I think that there's more and more people who maybe are starting to process. Amazing things are happening. You know, obviously Untangle launched, and it's brilliant. And there's lots of other bereavement support that's really like kind of taken off over this time, because it's needed. But finding new connections in those places is sometimes the best thing that you can do, because they are the people who will understand you, and they're the people who will make those difficult days easier. My two best friends now are people that I didn't even know when Dad was alive. They're the best people in the world. They support me through everything, every bad day, every good day. They are absolute rocks. And they never met him. They were never here before. We just met through this crazy grief community, and I just have no idea how my life existed before them. So I think it's really good, great that you're here and do communicate with each other on the Untangle grief chat and stuff, because those are the places that you'll make those connections.
I think Christina's just asked a bit more about Untangle. I will step in at this point. Hi, Christina. So for those of you that don't know Untangle, we are a supportive community for people who've had a bereavement. So we run events like these. We run video, in-person and chat support groups. So whatever medium is best for you, we do those on Fridays and Sundays. We've just started doing them in London in person as well. And then we have help. So if you have any questions or you're feeling a bit low, there's a chat line that you can text and not text, but on web message to get any support. So we can help with things like if you're having to fill out forms around probate, we can help you with those. Or we can just, if you're having, one of those griefy days and just want to talk, we're there. And then we also work with solicitors and therapists and that are very affordable. And funeral directors, so lots of different partners that we really carefully select to make sure that they understand, they're very supportive and they offer a good service. So if you need any extra help, we can match you to those partners as well. That's Untangle in a nutshell. We're constantly looking at what more we can do to support people. So most of the team have had bereavements, and that's why we want to set something up to make it easier, because the last thing you want is to start having to look for help when you're already feeling overwhelmed. And we know how lonely grief can be as well. So that was why, having other people who get it and you don't have to explain yourself, you can just be, is what we do. That's the link to Untangle. And there's another link. I'm going to link Lucy's podcast as well, which is a wonderful, comforting and enjoyable listen. So Heidi, I've just put it in the chat then.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. There was a point that Jax has just made actually about not losing people due to people not understanding, having not lost somebody to COVID. I think COVID grief is a really, really unique grief. People who've lost somebody to this virus is it's a completely independent grief, and it's something that we don't understand grief from diseases and viruses that have been living for many, many years. We haven't even processed how we begin to understand those. COVID has been incredibly cruel to families and to patients who have suffered with this virus. And there is such a long way for us to go to try and understand how we now support people who never had those goodbyes, who didn't have that support, who didn't have real funerals, who didn't have so many moments were taken away from people due to the pandemic. And that's something that's going to take a long time to figure out how to build the best kind of support system for it. So I can completely understand why you wouldn't feel like you found people who connect with you or understand how that feels. Although there are hundreds of thousands of families that have been bereaved, actually connecting with somebody who has a very similar story to you, because COVID has been very, very different for lots of families. It's been really, really difficult.
Just coming in on that. So one of the things that we try and do at Untangle is match people who've had a similar experience of loss together. So we are introducing more support groups that are specific to, COVID loss or different circumstances. So that's on there, because echoing what Lucy said, that it's such a different experience. Not having all those rituals and goodbyes and everything.
There's a couple of points in the chat around kind of losing your identity, losing who you were before, having, harsher thoughts or feeling like you're not able to connect with people the same way. Identity is a huge thing in grief. Losing your identity is very, very common, whether it's because you feel like you're not a wife anymore, or you're not a daughter anymore, or you're not a sibling anymore, a sister or a brother. You lose so much of your identity in grief because that person, you know, disappears, and it can make you very, very bitter and very, very angry. I think try not to be scared of that version of yourself and allow that person to have those thoughts and feelings. I mean, like, it's really hard. You don't want to be an angry person for the rest of your life, and you won't be, but it's about finding those releases, finding a way that you can get those thoughts out and get those feelings out. And if it means, you know, not talking to the person who makes you angry, or not talking to the person who tells you, well, you know, they're in a better place, you need to just get on with things now, because that's so often the case. Especially, you know, for example, my mum's era, who have been told that they just need to get on with things, and that they need to be happy, and they need to just be strong for the person who's died. And that, of course, echoes down generations. And for, you know, people who've kind of in touch with in grief now and grief communities, they know that's actually not really how it works. So, you know, you will have those thoughts, you'll have those feelings, but they won't be there forever. You will be angry, like, you have every right to be angry. Something really bad has happened and you're trying to adjust to this new normal, but taking time to recognize that actually, like, normal isn't what normal used to look like, and being able to adjust your mindset so that you can kind of approach this new world that this person no longer is in, is really, really important. Thanks, Georgia. Yeah, Christina saying anger can be empowering. I would completely agree. I think that I am now so much more assertive, and I'm so much more passionate about doing something to change the way that we look at grief. It, like, my anger through grief, I've really channeled into something that I'm really, really passionate about now. And whether that's creating a compassionate workplace, or whether it's because I'm the person that will have a conversation about my dead dad in a pub with a group of friends, you know, it's really powerful to be able to have these conversations and to be able to channel that anger, that energy, that frustration, you know, that feeling that you've been wrong done by. If you can channel it into something that you can be really passionate about, it's really, really important. It's not always a negative thing. It's a really good point. Yeah, Jax, you won't be alone. There'll be lots of people at the moment, especially at the moment, who are struggling with who are struggling with going out. But like Francesca's just said, you've done a great, you know, brilliant first step coming along to sessions like this, and maybe this is a really good way of you integrating back into that new normal. Like I was saying earlier on, sometimes you don't want to get up and go off to the office and find a new job, or meet up with colleagues, or meet up with friends. Taking these small steps, surrounding yourself with people who at least can empathize and can sympathize and can be more compassionate towards your situation, is a really big first step, and a really good one to take to getting you back, you know, to where you want to be. The drinking one is an interesting one, and it's something that comes up quite often. I also stopped drinking due to my anxiety. I stopped drinking just before my dad died, actually, because I was worried that I'd get a call in the middle of the night and I wouldn't be able to go and see him because I'd been drinking the night before. And during lockdown, I think lots of people's drinking habits changed. And it can be really difficult when your friends think of you as like the fun, the one who's going to go out and buy all the rounds of drinks and have loads of fun and it's going to be great, for them not to be able to accept that. There's some brilliant pages that support kind of sober communities, and I would really recommend following them. I'm trying to think, is it Millie, do you know if it's Millie Gooch that runs the Sober Girls Society, maybe, or Sober Society? And it's really good. Yeah, Sober Girls Society, really, really good. I would really recommend following those sorts of places. because again, you know, it's finding those people that you connect with, and hopefully your friends will be reasonable and not exclude you from situations, and understand that actually it's so that, you know, you don't have that anxiety, you don't have that depression that follows those big nights out.
Shall we, I was gonna say we've got a few minutes left. I feel like this could go on forever because everyone's got such unique stories, and there's also a lot of commonality between everyone's sharing and experiencing. So I'm gonna wrap it up. But Heidi, Jax, Gemma, thank you so much for sharing, and everyone else who's contributed as well. So we run support groups, and some of your names are familiar, and I hopefully see you at some point. But on Friday, we do a 15-minute drop-in on Zoom. So if you want to come and just meet others and have a little chat, they're only 15 minutes. So if it's your first time, you can keep your camera off, you can just listen if you feel more comfortable. But really, I want to say a huge thank you, Lucy. That was so interesting, so insightful. I think it's really helpful that you kind of outlined people's rights, but then gave them options and ideas for how to actually manage and cope with returning to work and being in work as well. And for also coming and sharing your experience, because I know it's not always an easy thing. You know, you book these things in advance, and then it's a dark Tuesday night and you're like, oh, I have to talk about this now. And so I think thank you so much for coming and sharing, and for all the amazing work that you're doing as well. So so grateful that you could come and share.
Thank you. Thanks. And I'll send over the slides to you so that if anybody wants them, I'm sure they can contact you. Or
yeah, we'll send a follow-up email out with the slides. Thank Perfect. You. Yeah. And there's the link to Untangle for those of you that don't know us and found us elsewhere as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening. I'm going to watch Bake Off on catch up.
Thanks, everyone, for sharing. Take care.